I'm sad in retrospect, hindsight's 2020. I'm sad that I wasn't more hard on Ace and Peter, the two original guys who played guitar and drums.
When the news broke,
we have some sad news to pass along here. The founding member of KISS has
that Ace Frehley, the iconic spaceman of KISS, had passed away. The world of rock and roll seemed to stand still. Fans across generations were left in disbelief, struggling to accept that one of the most electrifying guitarists in music history was gone. The man whose riffs defined a generation and whose rebellious energy shaped the sound of the 1970s had taken his final bow. But what shocked everyone even more came days later. At his funeral, Gene Simmons, his longtime bandmate and often his harshest critic, delivered a tribute that left the entire world speechless. The two men had shared a complicated bond, filled with brotherhood, rivalry, and years of silence. For decades, their relationship was marked by tension and unspoken pain. Yet when Gene stood before the crowd to say goodbye to Ace, the emotion in his voice silenced every rumor, every grudge, every scar from the past. This wasn't Gene Simmons the performer. This was Gene Simmons the friend, vulnerable, raw, and deeply human. As Gene spoke, the room fell completely still. Every word he said carried the weight of 4 decades, of music, fame, heartbreak, and the kind of love that can only exist between brothers who lived through the chaos of stardom together. What he revealed about Ace's final days, their last conversation, and the regrets he carried left even the toughest rockers in tears. It wasn't just a farewell, it was redemption. Before the world mourned Ace Frehley, they celebrated him, the face-painted rebel who gave KISS their signature sound and their edge. In the 1970s, when rock music was dominated by excess and ego, Ace stood out as something raw and unpredictable. With his thunderous solos and lightning-fast fingers, he didn't just play guitar, he made it speak. His riffs were dangerous, his stage presence magnetic, and his attitude pure rebellion. But behind that leather-clad persona was a shy, sensitive man who often hid his pain behind a wall of humor and bravado. When Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley first met Ace during KISS's early auditions, they immediately knew he was different. He wasn't just another guitarist, he was a force. From the moment he plugged in his guitar and unleashed that first wild solo, the room vibrated with energy. That's the sound, Gene later recalled. That's what we'd been missing. Together, they created a band that would redefine rock theatrics forever. The costumes, the makeup, the fire-breathing, it was all part of a grand vision. But at its heart was the music, and at the core of that music was Ace. In those early days, Gene and Ace were inseparable. Off stage, they joked like brothers. Gene often described Ace as the chaos to my discipline. Where Gene was the businessman, Ace was the artist, wild, unpredictable, and full of heart. The chemistry between them wasn't just creative. It was deeply emotional. They balanced each other, the fire and the foundation. Together they built something that would outlast even their friendship. But success came at a price. As KISS exploded into fame, the pressures of touring, fame, and constant media attention began to wear on the band. Ace, always more introverted, struggled to adjust. The endless touring schedules and the demands of perfection clashed with his free-spirited nature. And as the years rolled on, the cracks began to show. Gene, ever the perfectionist, wanted structure. Ace wanted freedom. The more disciplined Gene became, the more Ace drifted into the world of excess, late nights, alcohol, and the wild rock and roll lifestyle that both fueled and destroyed him. The brotherhood that once seemed unbreakable began to crumble. By the early 1980s, their friendship was buried beneath resentment and silence. Even after Ace left the band, Gene couldn't escape his presence. Every time he stepped on stage, every time he heard a roaring guitar solo, he was reminded of the man who helped create KISS's identity. In interviews, Gene often tried to downplay Ace's absence, but those who knew him said there was always a sadness in his eyes when Ace's name came up. Years turned into decades. They reunited for tours only to drift apart again. The chemistry was still there, but so was the hurt. Ace once said in an interview, "I love Gene. but sometimes love doesn't mean you can be around someone. It was a bittersweet truth that both men carried quietly. When news of Ace's declining health began to circulate, Gene stayed silent, publicly at least. But privately, friends close to him said he was deeply affected. For all their differences, Gene knew what Ace had meant to his life, and to millions of fans who saw in Ace the dreamer who refused to play by anyone's rules. And so, when the day came that Ace Frehley took his final bow, Gene Simmons, the man who once called him his difficult brother, stood before a grieving crowd and found the words to honor the man he could never truly replace. It wasn't just a eulogy. It was a confession. Decades of unspoken truth finally finding a voice. The day of Ace Frehley's funeral was unlike anything the music world had seen in years. Fans from across the globe gathered outside the small New York chapel where the service was held, holding guitars, candles, and Kiss memorabilia. Some wore replicas of his famous spaceman makeup, others carried old vinyl records, silent tributes to the man who had defined their youth. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with emotion. The dim light from the stained glass windows cast soft colors across the pews, where legends of rock sat shoulder to shoulder. Paul Stanley, Peter Criss, Gene Simmons, and dozens of other musicians whose lives had been touched by Ace's influence. But the most powerful moment came when Gene Simmons stepped forward. For a brief moment, the room fell silent. Everyone knew their history, the years of tension, the public feuds, the quiet reconciliations. Many wondered if Gene would even attend. Yet here he was, dressed in black, his usual armor of confidence replaced by a vulnerability no one had ever seen. As he approached the podium, Gene paused, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Ace's closed casket. The silence stretched on until he finally spoke. "For most of my life," he began, "I thought I knew what strength was. But then I met Ace Frehley, and I learned that strength isn't about control, it's about spirit." His voice trembled slightly as he continued. "Ace was wild. He was unpredictable. He was impossible to manage. But that's what made him magic." Every word cut through the air like a chord struck deep in the soul. Gene spoke not as a rock legend, but as a man remembering his brother. "We didn't always get along," he admitted, "but no one, and I mean no one, could ever play the way Ace played. He didn't just play notes. He told stories through his guitar. And even when we weren't speaking, I could still hear him." Tears filled the eyes of fans and fellow musicians alike. Paul Stanley, seated near the front, wiped his face quietly, his usual stoicism replaced by visible heartbreak. When Gene paused, the sound of quiet sobs filled the chapel. "I'll never forget," Gene continued, "the last time I saw him. He looked at me, smiled, and said, 'We did it, didn't we, Gene?' And I just nodded, because we did. We made something that will live forever." That single moment, that shared understanding between two men who had weathered everything from fame to failure, became the emotional peak of the ceremony. Gene's tribute was more than just words. It was a final act of forgiveness, of acknowledgement, and of love. When he finished, Gene placed a single silver guitar pick on Ace's casket. "You'll need this," he whispered, "wherever you're going." The gesture brought the entire room to tears. For a man known for his bravado and sharp tongue, Gene's sincerity was overwhelming. It was the kind of tribute that stripped away fame, ego, and history, leaving only truth. Outside, fans had gathered in silence, listening through speakers set up along the street. When Gene's words echoed through the crowd, people began to chant Ace's name, not as a farewell, but as a celebration. "Ace! Ace! Ace!" It was a sound that rolled through the air like a final encore, one last standing ovation for the man who had given so much to rock and roll. As the ceremony ended, Gene lingered by the casket long after everyone had gone. A few close friends approached, but he simply shook his head, staring at the coffin in quiet reflection. For the first time in decades, Gene Simmons wasn't the frontman of Kiss. He was just Gene, saying goodbye to his brother. And though Ace Frehley was gone, his music and the bond they shared would live forever. As the service continued, The air in the hall seemed thick with emotion. Every fan, friend, and fellow musician gathered knew that they were witnessing something historic. Not just the farewell of a rock legend, but the mending of old wounds that had once divided one of rock's most iconic bands. When Gene Simmons slowly approached the stage, the room fell completely silent. For decades, Gene and Ace had shared a turbulent history filled with creative brilliance and personal clashes. Yet in that moment, none of it mattered. The world's eyes were on Gene, waiting to hear what he would say about the man he once called both his brother and his rival. With his bass-shaped heart heavy, Gene adjusted the microphone and began to speak. Ace was more than just a guitarist, he said, his voice breaking slightly. He was the spark that ignited our madness. He brought chaos, laughter, and something no one could ever replicate. His soul. Those words struck deep. Fans began to cry quietly, realizing how much love and regret hid behind Gene's calm tone. He spoke not as a businessman or a rock star, but as a man mourning someone who had shaped his life. Gene went on to recall the early days of KISS, the small clubs, the endless rehearsals, the wild dreams that seemed impossible at the time. "We were just kids," he said softly. "Kids with paint on our faces and stars in our eyes. Ace, he was the dreamer among us. He believed in the impossible, and somehow he made the impossible happen." Paul Stanley, seated nearby, was visibly emotional. He nodded in agreement, his eyes glistening as Gene continued. The rivalry between Gene and Ace had been legendary, but now it seemed small, even foolish, compared to the love and respect shining through in Gene's words. As Gene's tribute grew deeper, he paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The silence was almost spiritual. "There were times," he admitted, "when we didn't see eye to eye. We fought, we argued, and sometimes we said things we couldn't take back. But underneath all that, I always knew Ace was one of a kind. There will never be another like him." Then, with a trembling voice, Gene shared something no one expected. "A few weeks before he passed, Ace called me," Gene revealed. He said, "Gene, whatever happened between us, I forgive you. I hope you forgive me too." I told him, "I already did, brother." That was the last time we spoke. The audience gasped quietly. It was a moment of closure the fans had never known about. For years, rumors had swirled about bad blood between the two, but now the truth was clear. They had made peace before the end. As Gene finished his speech, he turned to the casket, placed his hand gently on it, and whispered something only he could hear. The room erupted in applause, not the kind that follows a concert, but the kind that honors a man's life, slow, emotional, and filled with gratitude. Music legends like Ozzy Osbourne, Alice Cooper, and members of Metallica sat in silence, visibly moved. Even the toughest rock icons couldn't hold back their tears. Gene's speech wasn't just a tribute to Ace Frehley. It was a reminder of what KISS had meant to millions. A brotherhood, a legacy, and a dream that would live forever. As the lights dimmed, the sound of Ace's iconic guitar riff filled the room. "Shock Me" played softly, echoing through the walls as a video montage showed moments from his life, his wild performances, his laughter backstage, his unforgettable grin behind the makeup. Fans stood together singing along through tears, their voices trembling yet full of love. That day, Gene Simmons didn't just honor a fallen friend. He gave Ace Frehley the send-off every rock legend deserves. As the final notes of "Shock Me" faded into silence, the entire hall stood still, the kind of quiet that speaks louder than any applause. The giant screens played rare clips of Ace laughing with the band, joking during interviews, and shredding his guitar in ways that reminded everyone why he became a legend. Fans held candles high, the flickering flames reflecting off the tears streaming down their faces. It wasn't just the end of an era. It felt like the closing chapter of something truly magical, a brotherhood that had shaped the world of rock for half a century. Gene Simmons remained seated for a long time after his tribute, his eyes fixed on the casket. Paul Stanley placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, a rare public display of emotion from two men who had seen and survived everything together. In that moment, there were no egos, no grudges, no record deals, only love, loss, and the weight of memories. When Paul eventually rose to speak, his voice was low but steady. Ace wasn't just a guitarist, he said. He was a force. He made us believe that music could be larger than life. Every time I heard him play, I remembered why we started this band in the first place. His words echoed through the hall, reminding everyone that behind the makeup and the fire-breathing performances, Kiss had always been about friendship and unity, something Ace had embodied right to the end. Paul then looked toward Gene and quietly said, "We went through storms together, but Ace was our anchor. No matter what happened, he kept us real." Gene nodded, unable to speak, visibly holding back tears. Later, as the crowd moved outside for a candlelight vigil, the night sky seemed to weep with them. Rain began to fall softly, as if the heavens themselves were mourning. Fans stood side by side, some wearing vintage Kiss makeup, others holding posters of Ace from decades past. They sang Beth and New York Groove, their voices blending into the sound of the rain. It was raw, imperfect, and absolutely beautiful, just like Ace's music. The service concluded with a final salute. Gene, Paul, Eric Singer, and Tommy Thayer carried Ace's guitar to the stage one last time. They placed it gently in front of a giant Kiss logo, surrounded by flowers and candles. Then, without a word, Gene picked up a pick and strummed a single note on the instrument. The sound echoed hauntingly through the speakers, resonating with every heart present. "That," Gene said softly into the microphone, "was Ace's sound, the sound that changed our lives." He then looked at the crowd and added, "We'll keep playing, we'll keep remembering, and we'll keep celebrating him, because legends don't die, they just turn up the volume somewhere else." As the event came to a close, Gene walked off the stage and looked up at the sky. Cameras caught the moment, his eyes wet, his expression unreadable, somewhere between grief and gratitude. Fans would replay that image for years, calling it one of the most powerful moments in rock history. In the days following the funeral, tributes poured in from every corner of the music world. Dave Grohl called Ace a pioneer who made guitars talk. Slash said, "Every kid who picked up a Les Paul after the 70s owes something to Ace Frehley." Even those who never met him felt his impact, but perhaps the most touching tribute came from Gene himself. A week later, he posted a simple message on social media. "The spaceman has returned to the stars. I'll miss you, brother." It was short, heartfelt, and said everything words could not. In the end, Ace Frehley's farewell was more than just a funeral. It was a celebration of passion, rebellion, and the unbreakable spirit of rock and roll. For millions, it reminded them that legends like Ace never really leave. They live on in the riffs, the memories, and the fire they sparked in all of us. And as Gene Simmons said in his final words that day, "The show may end, but the music never dies."